Before the great age of stone, before the cold, unyielding walls that still scar the landscapes of Europe, there was earth and timber. There was the Motte and Bailey. Imagine, if you will, a landscape not yet tamed, a place of dense forests and marshland, where power was a fleeting and brutal concept. A lord needed to claim land, to hold it, and to be seen holding it. He needed a fortress, but he needed it now. There was no time for quarries and stonemasons, no time for the slow, ponderous work of generations. There was only the urgent, pressing need for dominance. And so they turned to the materials at hand, the very soil under their feet and the trees of the forest. The Motte and Bailey Castle was an exercise in brutal pragmatism. It was less a piece of architecture and more a violent act of landscaping. The process began with the Motte. This was a great conical mound of earth, sometimes natural but more often man-made, a colossal effort of peasant labour. Hundreds of men, armed with little more than wicker baskets and wooden shovels, would dig a deep circular ditch. The earth they excavated, tons upon tons of clay, rock and topsoil, was piled into the centre. It was packed down layer by layer until it formed a steep artificial hill, sometimes 30, 40, even 50 feet high. The sheer scale of this earth moving is difficult to comprehend now, accomplished without machinery, powered only by sweat and fear. The steepness of the Motte's sides was a defence in itself. To scramble up its slippery, muddy face in armour, under a hail of arrows, was a grim and often final task. Atop this newly made hill, a wooden tower was erected. This was the keep, the ultimate refuge in the Lord's private domain. It was not the grand stone structure we imagine today. It was a simple, functional blockhouse of green timber, perhaps 2 or 3 stories high, surrounded by a sturdy wooden fence, a palisade. From this vantage point, the Lord and his household guards could survey the surrounding countryside for miles, a visible and constant reminder of who was in charge. At the foot of the Motte lay the Bailey. This was a much larger enclosed courtyard, defended by another ditch and another timber palisade. The Bailey was the heart of the castle's daily life. It contained the barracks for the soldiers, the stables for the horses, the kitchens, the forge, the chapel, the great hall where the Lord would hold court. It was a small, self-contained and heavily fortified village, microcosm of the feudal world packed within its wooden walls. The genius of this design was its speed. An army could arrive in a newly conquered territory, and within a matter of weeks, sometimes even days, a fully functional fortress would rise from the ground. The Bayeux Tapestry, that remarkable embroidered chronicle of the Norman conquest, shows us this very process. We see William the Conqueror's men at Hastings in 1006 digging the ditch, piling up the Motte and hastily erecting a wooden fort. These were not permanent garrisons, they were military outposts, pins pushed into a map to mark subjugated territory. After his victory, William embarked on a castle-building campaign of unprecedented scale, dotting the English landscape with these raw, aggressive assertions of power. For the conquered Anglo-Saxons, the sight of a Motte and Bailey rising on the horizon was a profound and terrifying symbol. It was the Norman yoke made manifest in earth and wood, a constant looming presence that dominated their lives and their land. But for all their strategic brilliance, these timber castles had 2 fatal weaknesses. The first was decay. Wood, especially green timber sunk into damp earth, rots. The palisades would weaken, the watchtowers would sag. A Motte and Bailey required constant, tiresome maintenance to remain effective. It was a temporary solution to the permanent problem of holding land. The second weakness, far more dramatic, was fire. A determined attacker didn't necessarily need to storm the walls, they simply needed to get close enough with a lit torch. A well-aimed fire arrow could turn the entire fortress into an inferno in minutes. The very material that allowed for its rapid construction was also the source of its ultimate vulnerability. The Lord, sitting in his wooden keep atop his earthen mound, might feel secure, but he was living in a tinderbox. A single spark could undo weeks of labour and erase his foothold in the region. It became clear as the chaos of the early medieval period began to settle into a more permanent feudal structure, that something more lasting was required. Power needed a more durable home. It needed a fortress that could not rot, a stronghold that could not burn. It needed stone, and so the age of the Great Stone Keep began. The transition was not instantaneous. It was a slow, expensive and laborious evolution. Stone was not a material of convenience. It had to be quarried, often from distant locations, cut into manageable blocks by skilled masons, and transported by ox cart or barge, a logistical nightmare that could take years. Building in stone was not a strategy for rapid conquest. It was a statement of permanent occupation. It announced to the world that the Lord was not merely passing through. He was here to stay. The Normans, having secured England with their wooden forts, were among the first to systematically embrace this new philosophy of permanence. The most iconic and perhaps the most important of these early stone fortresses is the White Tower, the heart of the Tower of London. Begun by William the Conqueror himself around 1078, it was a structure of terrifying novelty for the people of London. It was not built of familiar English timber and earth. It was constructed from a pale, almost luminous limestone imported all the way from Caen in Normandy, the Conqueror's own homeland. The stone itself was a foreign imposition, a stark white ghost rising on the banks of the Thames. The White Tower established the template for the Norman keep. It was a massive rectangular block, a single monolithic building designed for passive defence. Its walls were immensely thick, up to 15 feet at the base, tapering slightly as they rose over 90 feet into the air. The windows were mere slits, high up the walls, designed not for viewing the scenery, but for an archer to shoot through with minimal risk of return fire. The primary entrance was not at ground level, where it would be vulnerable to battering rams, but on the first floor, accessible only by a wooden staircase that could be easily destroyed or removed in the event of an attack. To enter the keep was to submit to its defences entirely. Inside, it was a vertical fortress palace. The basement was for storage, containing the well, the single most critical feature for surviving a siege, and cellars for food and wine. The ground floor housed the garrison. The main floor, the one accessed by the external staircase, contained the Great Hall, the centre of public life where the Lord would dispense justice and entertain guests. Above that were the private chambers for the Lord and his family, and at the very top, nestled within the thick walls, was the Chapel of St. John, a serene and beautiful space of Norman arches, a stark contrast to the grim functionality of the rest of the building. Life inside was dark, cold, and often smoky from the open fires, but it was, above all else, secure. The keep was a sanctuary of last resort. If the outer defences fell, the entire population of the castle could retreat into this stone box and wait out the storm. For centuries, this design, the great rectangular keep, dominated fortress architecture across Europe. From Rochester in Kent to Locques in France, these imposing towers became the ultimate symbols of feudal authority. They were designed not only to repel armies, but also to intimidate the local populace. A peasant toiling in the fields, looking up at the clean, hard lines of the new stone keep on the hill, understood the message perfectly. This was not a temporary military camp. This was power made permanent, as solid and enduring as the rock from which it was built. It was a constant, silent declaration of ownership. But even these mighty stone boxes had their flaws. Their sheer height and rectangular shape made them vulnerable to siege engines like the trebuchet, which could hurl massive stones with devastating force. And crucially, their square corners were a significant weak point. Attackers learned that they could undermine a corner through a process called sapping, digging a tunnel, propping it up with wooden beams, and then setting the beams on fire. When the props collapsed, the corner of the keep would crumble, creating a catastrophic breach. Military engineers knew they could do better. The simple, massive keep was a powerful statement, but it was not the final word in the art of defence. The castle needed to evolve, to become a more complex, more intelligent system of interlocking parts. It needed to become more than just a single strong building. It needed to become a fortress. This evolution led to the development of the medieval castle as we truly picture it, a complex, multi-layered defensive ecosystem. Let us take a guided tour through one of these mature fortresses, beginning from the outside and working our way in to understand the genius and the brutal logic of its design. The first thing one would encounter is the moat. This was a wide, deep ditch encircling the entire castle. A moat could be wet, filled with water from a nearby river or spring, which presented an obvious and formidable obstacle to men in heavy armour. But many moats were dry. Their purpose was not necessarily to drown attackers, but to create a steep, open killing ground. A dry moat prevented attackers from bringing siege towers or battering rams right up to the base of the walls. It also made the practice of sapping far more difficult, as miners would have to start their tunnels from much farther away, exposing themselves to the defenders on the walls for longer. Crossing the moat required a bridge, which led directly to the castle's most sophisticated and most dangerous feature, the gatehouse. The gatehouse was the castle's front door, and as such, it was the single most vulnerable point. Consequently, it became the most heavily fortified. A simple gateway and a wall was no longer sufficient. The mature gatehouse was a fortress in its own right, a multi-storey stone structure often flanked by two powerful towers. The approach was a carefully orchestrated death trap. An attacker advancing across the bridge would first have to contend with a drawbridge, which could be raised to create a vertical barrier and open up a pit below. If they managed to cross that, they would find themselves in a narrow passageway, a tunnel running through the gatehouse. This passage was known, with a certain grim honesty, as the murder hole. It was open to the sky or had openings in the ceiling through which defenders in the rooms above could drop all manner of unpleasant things: rocks, boiling water, hot sand that would get inside armour, or quicklime to blind them. The passage was sealed at either end by a portcullis, a heavy grille of iron-tipped wood that could be dropped in an instant, trapping attackers inside the kill zone. There were often several portcullises and thick wooden doors, creating a series of compartments. The goal was to break up an assault, to trap small groups of enemies and eliminate them piecemeal. Arrow slits lined the walls of the passage, allowing archers and crossbowmen to fire into the trapped mass of men from relative safety. To successfully storm a well-defended gatehouse was a near impossible task, a nightmarish claustrophobic ordeal. Sometimes an even more elaborate outdated defence, called a barbican, was built in front of the gatehouse, a walled passage with twists and turns, forcing attackers into a confusing maze before they even reached the main gate. If an attacker somehow survived the gatehouse and gained entry to the castle grounds, or if they chose to assault the main perimeter, they would face the curtain walls. These were the high, thick stone walls that enclosed the bailey, the main courtyard of the castle. In early castles, these were often just simple barriers, but by the High Middle Ages they had become sophisticated defensive platforms. At the top of the wall ran a walkway, the allure protected by the battlements. This is the classic sawtooth pattern we associate with castles. The solid, upright sections are the merlons, behind which a defender could shelter. The gaps between them are the crenels through which he could shoot an arrow or drop a rock before ducking back behind the merlon. It was a simple but effective system that provided both cover and a field of fire. Later, wooden galleries called hoardings were built jutting out from the top of the walls. These structures had holes in their floors, allowing defenders to drop missiles directly onto the heads of anyone trying to scale the wall with ladders below. Hoardings were effective, but being made of wood, they were vulnerable to fire. This led to their stone equivalent, the machicalation. These were permanent stone projections with openings in the floor, offering the same defensive advantages as hoardings, but without the fire risk. A wall topped with machicolations was an incredibly formidable obstacle. Yet perhaps the most important innovation in curtain wall design was the flanking tower. A long, straight stretch of wall, no matter how tall or thick, has a fatal flaw, a dead zone at its base. Defenders on the battlements cannot shoot straight down. Attackers who reached the foot of the wall were relatively safe, free to use battering rams or to begin the slow, patient work of mining. The solution was to build towers that projected outwards from the curtain wall at regular intervals. From the top of these towers, archers and crossbowmen could fire along the face of the adjoining wall, a devastating technique known as enfilading fire or flanking fire. Any attacker trying to scale the wall between two towers would be caught in a lethal crossfire. There would be no dead zones, no safe places to hide. These towers also changed shape over time. Early Norman towers were often square, but as we saw with the Great Keeps, square corners were a structural weakness and created blind spots for the defenders. The eventual answer was the round tower, or the D-shaped tower, which was rounded on the outside and flat on the inside. A round tower was stronger, better able to deflect projectiles from siege engines, and it offered a 180-degree field of fire with no blind corners. A castle like Caernarfon in Wales, built by Edward I in the late 13th century, is a masterclass in this principle. Its curtain wall studded with powerful multi-sided towers that created overlapping fields of fire, making a direct assault on the walls a suicidal proposition. The entire fortress was no longer just a wall, but an integrated weapon system, where every part supported every other part in a symphony of defensive geometry. Each element, the moat, the gatehouse, the curtain wall, the flanking towers, worked in concert to create a layered defence that could exhaust, demoralise and ultimately destroy an attacking army long before they reached the final sanctuary of the keep, which by this era often stood as a final, formidable exclamation point inside the walls, a lordly residence and an ultimate bastion of defiance. The journey from a muddy hill topped with a wooden shack to a complex, stone-built machine for war was a long one, a process of trial and error written in blood and stone over centuries, a testament to the relentless human drive for security in a violent and uncertain world. The idea of a castle, the sheer colossal fact of it, begins not with a stone but with a decision made by a king, a duke, or a baron, a man with land, ambition, and a healthy dose of paranoia. He needs to project power, to cow the locals, to guard a river crossing, to secure a newly conquered frontier. He needs a fist of stone on the landscape, and for that he needs a man who understands the language of stone. He needs a master mason. This was no simple stoneworker. The master mason was the architect, the engineer, the project manager, and the logistics chief of the largest, most expensive, most complex undertakings of the medieval age. He was a man of immense skill and reputation, often an itinerant professional who moved from one great project to the next. His name whispered with a kind of reverence usually reserved for knights or bishops. Consider a man like Master James of St. George, a genius from Savoy, whom King Edward I of England imported in the late 13th century to enact his vision of an iron ring of castles to subjugate the Welsh. For a fee of 3 shillings a day, a fortune more than most knights earned, Master James didn't just build castles like Harlech, Caernarfon and Beaumaris, he orchestrated them. He would arrive at a raw, wind-swept site, perhaps a rocky promontory overlooking the sea, and in his mind's eye he would see it. He would walk the ground, tracing the lines of curtain walls with his boot, noting the fall of the land, the prevailing wind, the points of natural strength and terrifying vulnerability. He understood geometry not as an abstract science, but as a practical magic that could raise 1,000 tons of stone into a tower that would touch the clouds and defy gravity for a millennium. He carried the entire design in his head and on a few precious reusable drawing boards, a tracing floor of plaster where he would sketch out the complex curves of a vault or the precise cut of a window arch at full scale. His tools were simple: a square, a compass, a plumb line. His genius was in using them to command armies of men and mountains of material. Once the site was chosen and the design conceived, the great, slow, grinding work of logistics began. First, the stone, the right kind of stone. Not just any rock would do. It had to be durable, workable, and if possible, beautiful. For the great Norman keeps that remade the English landscape after 1006, this meant importing vast quantities of pale, fine-grained limestone from Caen in Normandy. It was a political statement as much as a practical choice, building English castles from French stone. The stone itself was cheap at the source. The real cost was in getting it from the earth and moving it to the site. An army of quarrymen descended on the chosen hillside, men with iron wedges, mallets, and immense patience. They would drive wedges into the lines of cleavage, listen for the groan and crack as a multi-ton block broke free, then lever it onto sledges or rollers with nothing but muscle and sweat. Then came the journey. This was the true bottleneck of medieval construction. Over land, the massive blocks were heaved onto heavy carts, drawn by teams of straining oxen, maybe a dozen or more for a single stone. They moved at the pace of a slow walk, turning roads into impassable mud, breaking axles, requiring entire teams of carters and blacksmiths just to keep the supply line moving. It was crushingly slow and ruinously expensive. Often the cost of transporting the stone just a few dozen miles could be 10 times the cost of quarrying it in the first place. Water was always the better option. If a castle site was near a navigable river or the coast, barges could be used to float the stone, a far more efficient method. This is why so many of Edward's great Welsh castles, Harlech, Conwy, Caernarfon, are built right on the water's edge. The sea was their highway, bringing not just stone but lime for mortar, timber for scaffolding and food for the workers. And what a workforce it was. At the peak of construction at a major site like Beaumaris in Anglesey, there might be over 3,000 men at work. It was a city rising from nothing, a swirling vortex of organised chaos. At the top of this pyramid, under the master mason, were the skilled artisans, the freemasons, who worked the freestone that could be carved in any direction, shaping the delicate tracery of a chapel window, or the sharp, clean corners of the quoins. The hewers, who took the rough quarry blocks and dressed them into standardised ashlar blocks with hammer and chisel, their rhythmic tapping a constant soundtrack to the site. There were carpenters by the hundred building the immense timber scaffolds that cloaked the rising walls, creating the internal floors and roofs, and constructing the complex treadwheel cranes. These cranes, powered by 1 or 2 men walking inside a giant wooden wheel, were the heavy lift technology of the age, hoisting baskets of mortar and individual stones hundreds of feet into the air with agonizing slowness. Blacksmiths were essential, endlessly sharpening tools, forging iron door hinges, and making the thousands upon thousands of nails required. These were skilled men, well paid, and they followed the work, a mobile community of craftsmen. But beneath them was the vast, anonymous base of the pyramid, the unskilled labourers, the quarrymen, the diggers who excavated the moats and foundations by hand, the men who mixed the mortar, a cocktail of lime, sand and water, and the hod carriers who bore the stones and mortar up endless ladders and ramps on their backs. Many of these men were not volunteers, they were peasants, conscripted through a system of forced labour known as corvée. They were compelled to leave their fields for a set number of days a year to work on the Lord's project for little or no pay. Their lives were hard, their work dangerous. A misplaced stone, a snapped rope on a crane, a collapsing scaffold. Death was a constant and unremarked presence on a medieval building site. For years, sometimes for a generation, this work would continue. The castle would grow inch by agonising inch. A project like the Tower of London was never truly finished. It was added to, modified and strengthened by successive kings over centuries. But a new build like Harlech could be raised to a defensible state in a remarkably short time, perhaps 5 or 6 years of intense, relentless effort, fueled by the entire tax revenue of a kingdom, a testament to the organisational power of the medieval state when it truly focused its will. And then, one day, the last timber of the scaffold is taken down. The dust settles. The din of construction, the hammering, the chipping, the shouting of foremen finally fades. It is replaced by a different set of sounds. The clang of a gate, the nicker of a horse, the cry of a sentry on the wall. The project is finished. The fortress has become a home. To step inside the gates of a newly completed castle was to enter a world in miniature, a compressed and fortified replica of the entire feudal society. It was a place of stark contrasts, of immense strength and surprising fragility, a public ceremony and cramped privacy, a brutal function and occasional breathtaking beauty. At its very heart, both physically and socially, was the Lord, the Castellan, and his family. They occupied the most secure and comfortable quarters, typically in the Great Keep or a dedicated residential block known as the Solar. Here, away from the drafts and clamour of the main hall, they had their private chambers. But privacy was a rare and precious commodity. These rooms were still thoroughfares for trusted servants, clerks, and advisers. The Lord's chamber was his office as much as his bedroom, the place where he met with his steward to review the estate accounts or plan the next military campaign with his constable. His wife, the lady of the castle, was no mere ornament. The chatelaine was a powerful figure in her own right, the manager-in-chief of a vast and complex domestic enterprise. She oversaw the food stores, the kitchens, the weaving and spinning, the education of the children, and the health of the entire household. And when her husband was away at war or at court, which was often, the defence of the castle itself fell to her. The social and administrative nucleus of the entire castle was the Great Hall. This was usually a vast two-storey chamber with a high timbered roof. By day it was a hub of ceaseless activity. The Lord would dispense justice from a chair on a raised platform, or dais, at one end. Locals would come to settle disputes, pay rents, and seek favours. Messengers arrived with news from the outside world. Knights and men-at-arms lounged on benches, gambling with dice, sharpening their weapons, or boasting of past deeds. The air was thick with the smoke from a central hearth, which often had no proper chimney, just a vent in the roof, leaving the rafters permanently blackened and the air perpetually hazy. It was filled with the smells of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, roasting meat, and the hounds that slept on the rush-strewn floor, gnawing on discarded bones. At mealtimes, long trestle tables would be set up. The Lord's family and high-ranking guests sat at the high table on the dais, eating from pewter or even silver plates. Everyone else sat below the salt, on long benches, eating from trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that soaked up the juices and could be eaten afterwards or given to the poor. The food was plentiful but monotonous for the lower ranks: bread, cheese, pottage and ale. For the high table there were more elaborate dishes: roasted peacocks, venison, complex pies and expensive wine. This was dining as theatre, a public reinforcement of the social order. Beyond the keep and the great hall lay the bailey, or courtyard. This was the castle's engine room, a bustling, noisy and often muddy expanse packed with the essential infrastructure of the community. Here were the stables under the care of the marshal with dozens of horses, from the Lord's mighty destrier to the humble pack ponies. The air was heavy with the smell of hay and manure. Nearby the blacksmith's forge glowed day and night, the rhythmic clang of his hammer an ever-present sound. There was a bakehouse, a brew house, for ale was safer to drink than water and a staple of the diet, and the kitchens, which were often housed in a separate building to reduce the risk of fire. Inside the kitchens, cooks and scullery maids toiled in searing heat, turning spits, tending cauldrons, and preparing food for hundreds of people every single day. The bailey also contained workshops for carpenters, armourers and fletchers. It might have a dovecote providing a year-round source of fresh meat, and perhaps a small vegetable and herb garden for the ladies' use. Barracks housed the garrison of soldiers, and small cottages provided shelter for the artisans and their families. It was a self-sufficient community, a place of constant work where chickens and pigs roamed freely, pecking at refuse, and children played under the watchful eyes of the men on the walls. Life for the vast majority of the castle's inhabitants was governed by the sun and the seasons. It was a life of routine, of hard physical labour, and of perpetual discomfort by our standards. The stone walls that made the castle so strong also made it incredibly cold and damp. Tapestries and wall hangings were not just for decoration. They were a vital layer of insulation against the chill that radiated from the stone. The only sources of heat were open fires, which filled the rooms with smoke, and the only light after sunset came from expensive beeswax candles for the rich, or foul-smelling tallow rushlights for the poor. Sanitation was a constant challenge. Toilets, known as garderobes, were little more than stone chutes built into the thickness of the outer walls, emptying directly into the moat below, or a cesspit at the base of the tower. The smell in summer must have been formidable. Water was the most critical resource, supplied by a deep well, which for security reasons was almost always located within the most defensible part of the castle, usually the keep or the inner bailey. For the common soldier or servant, life could be intensely boring. Endless hours were spent on guard duty, staring out at the same unchanging landscape. This was punctuated by training in the bailey, archery practice, drills with sword and shield, and relieved by gambling, storytelling, and the simple human need for gossip. This entire intricate society, the lord in his solar, the knight in the hall, the baker in his shop, the guard on the wall, functioned like a well-oiled machine. But this self-contained world, this fortress home, was built for one ultimate purpose: to withstand its opposite. It was designed to endure the moment when the world outside turned hostile, when a foreign army appeared on the horizon and the routines of peace were shattered by the brutal art of the siege. A siege was not a single furious battle. It was a slow, methodical, and profoundly psychological process. A grim contest of engineering, logistics, and will. Began not with a clash of arms, but with a dreadful seance. An attacking army would appear, unfurl its banners, and methodically encircle the castle. This was the investment. Every road was blocked, every path guarded. The castle was now an island, cut off from all hope of supply, reinforcement, or news. The gates were barred, the portcullis dropped, and the defenders on the wall would watch as the enemy began to build a small town of their own, tents, pavilions, and siege lines, creating a new, hostile landscape around them. The first weapon deployed was always fear. The attacker might offer terms, surrender now and be spared. To refuse was to invite ruin. Sometimes the easiest way to take a castle was not to break its walls, but its spirit, or to find a weak link in its human chain. A disgruntled guard could be bribed to open a postern gate in the dead of night. A traitor within could start a fire or poison the well. Treachery was always cheaper than a full-scale assault. If the defender's resolve held, the siege proper began. The slowest, most certain method was starvation. A well-stocked castle could hold out for months, even over a year, but its resources were finite. The attacker simply had to wait, repelling any relief force and tightening the cordon. The defenders would begin rationing. First the wine, then the grain, then the salted meat. They ate their horses, then the dogs, then the rats. The great variable was water. If the castle's well ran dry or was fouled, the end would come quickly. But a determined attacker, especially a king with the resources of a state behind him, rarely had such patience. He wanted the castle now, and for that he brought his engines. From the safety of the siege lines, carpenters and engineers would begin assembling the heavy artillery of the Middle Ages. The king of these machines, the weapon most feared by any castle defender, was the trebuchet. This was not the simple torsion-powered catapult of the Roman era. The trebuchet was a monster of physics, a huge throwing arm pivoted on an axle, with a sling at one end and an immense movable counterweight box at the other, filled with tons of earth and lead. A team of men would use windlasses to slowly winch the long arm down, a process that could take half an hour. The sling would be loaded, not with a small rock, but with a massive, carefully shaped stone weighing 200 or 300 pounds. On command, the trigger was released. The colossal counterweight would plummet and the arm would whip upwards with terrifying speed, launching its projectile in a high, graceful arc. It was surprisingly accurate. A good crew could repeatedly strike the same spot on a castle wall from hundreds of yards away. The impact was devastating. It didn't just chip the stone, it pulverized it. The constant concussive thud, thud, thud of the trebuchet day and night was a physical and psychological assault, a relentless percussion that shook the very foundations of the walls and the morale of the men inside. They also threw other things. The rotting carcasses of horses and cattle were lobbed over the walls to spread disease, a primitive form of biological warfare. Sometimes, for pure psychological terror, they would launch the heads of captured soldiers or send a captured messenger back with his message, just not in the way he had intended. While the great engines hammered the walls from a distance, other forces prepared for a more direct approach. The most straightforward tactic was to attack the gate, usually the weakest point. To do this, attackers used a battering ram, a massive tree trunk, sometimes capped with an iron head, suspended by chains from a heavy timber frame. This entire apparatus was housed under a sturdy movable shed, often covered with wet animal hides to protect it from fire arrows. This shed was called a cat or a sow, and under its protection, a team of men would slowly swing the ram, building a rhythm, gaining momentum, till it crashed against the thick oak of the gate or the stone of the gatehouse with sickening force. From the walls above, defenders would drop anything they could to stop it. Huge rocks, vats of boiling water or hot sand that could get inside armour, and quicklime to blind the attackers. If the walls themselves were the target, the attacker might construct a siege tower or belfry. This was a multi-storey wooden tower on wheels, as tall as the curtain walls themselves. It was slowly, painstakingly pushed towards the wall by teams of men, all while under a constant barrage of arrows and stones from the defenders. Its purpose was to act as a bridge, to get a large number of assault troops onto the battlements at once. A drawbridge at the top could be lowered onto the parapet, and the attackers would storm across. Siege towers were devastatingly effective, but they were also hugely vulnerable. They were slow-moving targets, and the defenders' primary goal was to set them on fire with flaming arrows or pots of Greek fire. But perhaps the most terrifying and insidious threat came not from above, but from below. This was the work of the sappers, or miners. Under the cover of darkness, or protected by a mobile shelter, a team of specialists would begin to dig. Their target was the foundation of a wall, or even better, a corner tower. They would dig a narrow, low tunnel, propping up the ceiling with heavy wooden beams as they went. It was claustrophobic, dark, and incredibly dangerous work. The defenders were constantly listening, placing bowls of water on the ground to detect the faint vibrations of digging. If they located the enemy mine, they would dig a countermine to intercept it, leading to vicious, blind combat in the suffocating darkness beneath the earth. If the sappers reached their goal undetected, they would pack the end of the tunnel, right beneath the foundation, with combustible material, brushwood, pitch, even pig fat, which burned with a particularly intense heat. They would light the fire and scramble out. As the wooden props burned away, the tunnel would collapse, and with its foundation gone, the tons of stone wall above it would collapse as well, creating a wide, ready-made breach for the waiting assault troops to pour through. This was the endgame. The patient deconstruction was over. The brutal, close-quarters fighting for the rubble of the breach would now decide the castle's fate. Every element of the castle's design, the height of its walls, the shape of its towers, the placement of every arrow slit and murder hole, was a response to this dreadful menu of destruction. It was a centuries-long arms race, a lethal dialogue written in stone and steel between the art of the builder and the ingenuity of the destroyer. So you see, the stone wall was not merely a wall, it was a conversation. A very deliberate and often very final argument with anyone presumptuous enough to approach it with ill intent. For every method of attack, for every aggressive question a siege engineer might ask, the master mason had already drafted a comprehensive and often painfully elegant reply. It was a science, this art of staying alive within a shell of stone, a brutal dialogue between force and resistance played out over centuries. And the grammar of this science was written into the very fabric of the castle itself. Imagine yourself as the defender, standing atop the wall walk of a 12th century castle. Below you, a besieging army swarms. The first line of defence isn't even the stone you're standing on, it's the ground itself. For hundreds of yards around the castle, the land has been cleared of every tree, every boulder, every ditch that could offer cover. This barren, open space is called the killing ground for a very good reason. An attacker must cross it under a constant hail of arrows, with nowhere to hide. As they get closer, they reach the ditch, or if the lord was particularly wealthy or the groundwater particularly high, the moat. A wide, deep moat was a beautiful thing. It stopped siege towers in their tracks, their massive wooden frames sinking into the mud. It made it impossible to wheel a battering ram up to the gate. It made the base of the wall exceptionally difficult for sappers and miners to reach. And even a dry ditch, a deep, steep-sided trench, forced attackers to descend and then ascend its far side, all while being systematically picked apart by the archers above. They were exposed, exhausted, and funneled into predictable paths, but let's say they make it across. Now they face the wall itself. This is not a simple flat surface. Look closely at the top. You see the iconic sawtooth pattern, the crenellations. The solid, upright parts are the merlons, the gaps between them are the crenels. This was not for decoration. It was a precise, calculated rhythm of safety and exposure. A crossbowman could step into the crenel, loose his bolt, and then immediately step back behind the solid stone merlon to reload his cumbersome weapon in relative safety. It was his office, his workspace. Now, look down the face of the wall. See those thin vertical slits? They are the arrow slits, or loopholes. From the outside they present a tiny, almost impossible target, but from the inside the wall is splayed, carved away into a wide alcove. This gave the archer inside a surprisingly broad field of fire, allowing him to aim left and right, up and down, while remaining almost entirely protected. Early slits were simple vertical cuts, but as the crossbow became more dominant with its horizontal arms, designers added a crossarm to the slit, creating the distinctive crosslet shape. Every slit was a carefully placed instrument positioned to cover a specific arc of the castle's perimeter, creating interlocking fields of fire so that no patch of ground was left unwatched. Should the enemy manage to bring ladders to the wall or roll a siege tower into place, the defenders had another answer ready. In earlier castles, this was a wooden gallery, a hoarding, that was cantilevered out from the top of the wall. It looked a bit like a covered balcony, and it had holes in the floor through which defenders could drop all manner of unpleasant things directly onto the heads of those below. But wood, of course, burns. So in time, master masons translated the concept into stone. These permanent overhanging stone galleries with their gaps in the floor are called machicolations. They are a sign of a later, more sophisticated castle. And what did they drop? Well, not so much the boiling oil you see in films. Oil was fantastically expensive, a precious commodity needed for lamps and cooking. Why waste it? Rocks were free and plentiful. Enormous stones could shatter limbs and break siege equipment. Casks of burning tar were effective. Cauldrons of heated sand were particularly nasty. It would get inside armour and cause excruciating burns. And sometimes it was as simple as the contents of the castle latrine. Humiliation was as much a weapon as any other. The greatest point of vulnerability, and therefore the greatest point of strength, was always the gate. The gatehouse was not an entrance. It was a trap, a marvel of layered, concentrated lethality. First, the attacker had to cross a drawbridge. Then they faced the portcullis, a heavy grille of iron-shod wood that could be dropped in an instant. Often, there wasn't just one portcullis, but two, or even three, spaced out along a stone tunnel. As the first attackers rushed into this dark passage, the outer portcullis would slam down behind them, and the inner one would remain shut before them. They were trapped, boxed in. And then, from the ceiling above, came death. The ceiling was a vault perforated with holes, the infamous murder holes. Through these, the defenders, safe in the room above the gate passage, could rain down arrows, quarrels, stone, and spears. The passage became a charnel house. Flanking the entire gatehouse were two powerful towers, studded with their own arrow slits, allowing defenders to fire into the sides of any force trying to assault the main doors. A direct assault on a well-designed gatehouse was little more than organised suicide. And this idea of layers, of defence in depth, was the guiding principle of mature castle design. The ultimate expression of this was the concentric castle. Imagine not one wall, but two, one inside the other, like a stone nesting doll. The outer wall was lower than the inner wall. This was crucial. It meant that archers on the inner wall could fire over the heads of their comrades on the outer wall, bringing a double dose of missile fire to bear on any attacker. If the enemy, against all odds, managed to breach the outer wall, they were not victorious. They were simply trapped in the narrow space between the two walls, a space now known as the Death Hole. Here, they were systematically annihilated by defenders on the inner wall, who held the commanding height and all the advantages. This profound, brutally effective concept wasn't born in the green fields of England or France. It was perfected thousands of miles away, under a hotter sun, in the crucible of the Crusades. The Holy Land was a high-stakes laboratory for military architecture. The Crusader states established in the Levant after the First Crusade in 1099 were a precarious enterprise. They were a tiny Christian minority ruling over a vast and often hostile population, surrounded by powerful Muslim states like the Ayyubids of Egypt and Syria. They were chronically short of manpower. A European lord might call upon his vassals to defend his castle for 40 days. A knight of the Order of the Hospital or the Temple in Outremer had to be prepared to defend his fortress for years, with only a few hundred brothers against armies that could number in the tens of thousands. Their castles could not be mere fortified manors. They had to be instruments of domination, immense, virtually impregnable fortresses from which a small garrison could control vast swathes of territory. It was a matter of survival, and survival is the mother of all invention. The Crusaders were not working in a vacuum. They encountered and learned from the sophisticated traditions of their adversaries and predecessors. They saw the formidable Byzantine fortifications with their complex use of layered walls and towers. They studied the ingenious designs of Arab desert forts, masters of water conservation and gatehouse defence. They blended these Eastern ideas with their own Western European traditions of stone keep construction, and in doing so they created something new, something far more advanced than anything that existed back home. The supreme example, the legend that still stands today as a testament to this fusion of genius, is the Crac de Chevalier in modern-day Syria. To see it, even now, is to understand power. It sits astride the Homs Gap, the only major pass between the coastal mountains and the interior, a strategic choke point of immense importance. From its ramparts, the Knights Hospitaller could see for miles, controlling the trade and military routes below. T. Lawrence, a man who knew a thing or two about desert warfare, called it perhaps the best preserved and most wholly admirable castle in the world. Approaching the crack, you first see its outer wall, a formidable curtain bristling with 13 powerful rounded towers. The use of round or D-shaped towers was a key innovation. Back in Europe, most castles still had square keeps and towers, but a square corner is a weak point. It presents a flat 90-degree angle to a catapult stone, absorbing the full impact. It's also a blind spot for defenders on the wall, and most importantly, miners could easily dig under a corner, prop it up with timbers, set the timbers on fire, and bring the whole structure crashing down. A rounded tower, by contrast, had no corners. A projectile was more likely to glance off its curved surface, dissipating the energy. There were no blind spots at its base, and it was structurally far more resistant to mining. The entire base of the outer wall is protected by a massive sloping plinth of stone called a talus. This served to further buttress the wall and to prevent sappers from getting near its foundations. Any rocks dropped from the machicolations above would also ricochet off the slope at unpredictable and lethal angles into the ranks of the attackers. If an attacker somehow breached this formidable outer shell, their reward was to find themselves in that deadly space between the walls. They would look up and see the true heart of the Crac de Chevalier, the inner ward. It looms high above the outer wall, a sheer cliff-like fortress in its own right, crowned with its own massive towers. The defenders, having fallen back to this inner sanctum, now held an overwhelming advantage of height. From the battlements of the inner ward, they could rain down destruction on the attackers now trapped and exposed in the outer ward below. This was concentric defence perfected. Even the entrance was a masterpiece of psychological and military warfare. It wasn't a straight path, it was a bent entrance. A long, vaulted ramp that forced any intruder to make several sharp turns, slowing their charge and exposing their unshielded right side to defenders in slits and galleries above. They were forced to fight their way uphill, in the dark, through a winding passage designed to break the momentum of any assault. Yet inside this brutal shell of military perfection was a different world. There was a beautiful Gothic cloister and a chapel, a great hall where the knights would eat, and vast storerooms capable of holding enough food and water for a garrison of 2,000 men to withstand a siege for 5 years. This was the genius of the Crusader castles. They were not just forts, they were self-sufficient colonies, the administrative and military headquarters of the great military orders. They projected power not just through their defences, but through their sheer permanence and their ability to endure. The great Muslim leader Saladin, a military genius in his own right, besieged the Crac in 1188. He captured the outer works, but after staring up at the impregnable inner ward, he simply gave up and marched away. It was that daunting. The lessons learned at places like the Crac, at the Templar stronghold of Chateau Pellerin on the coast, or the mighty Hospitaller fortress of Margau were not forgotten. When knights and kings returned to Europe from the Crusades, they brought these new ideas with them. Richard the Lionheart of England, returning from the Third Crusade, built Chateau Gaillard in Normandy. It was a revelation in European design, with its rounded towers, its complex outer works, and its focus on projecting missile fire. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, built new preceptories across Europe, in London, in Paris, that incorporated these advanced designs. The seeds of a revolution in castle building had been carried back from the Holy Land, and they were about to find their most fertile ground in the cold, damp mountains of North Wales, under the direction of an English king who had been on crusade himself, a king who understood that a castle was not just a building, but the ultimate expression of political will. His name was Edward IV, a tall, formidable man known to history as Longshanks, and to the Welsh as a conqueror. Edward had been on the Eighth Crusade as a young man. He had seen the great fortresses of the East, and he had learned their lessons well. When he ascended to the throne of England in 1272, he inherited a perennial problem: Wales. The Welsh princes, particularly Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Prince of Wales, fiercely defended their independence from the English crown. For Edward, this could not stand. He was determined to bring Wales under his control completely and irrevocably, and he knew that military victory on the battlefield was not enough. To truly conquer a people and a landscape, he needed to dominate it. He needed castles, not just one or two, but an entire system, a network of the most advanced, most expensive and most intimidating fortresses the world had ever seen. He would build an iron ring. This was not a private venture by some local lord. This was a state-sponsored project on an industrial scale, the medieval equivalent of a moon mission. Edward poured the full resources of the English treasury into his Welsh campaign. He conscripted thousands of labourers from every corner of his kingdom: masons, carpenters, smiths, diggers. He organised vast supply chains, shipping stone, timber, lead, and food by sea, as the sea was the one thing he could control more easily than the Welsh mountains. And to oversee this grand design, he hired a genius, a man named Master James of St. George, a master mason and military architect from Savoy, in the Alps, a region known for its advanced fortifications. Edward paid him the princely sum of 3 shillings a day, more than any other royal servant, and gave him near total authority over the works. It was the perfect combination: a king with a clear strategic vision and unlimited resources, and an architect with the technical brilliance to realise it. The castles they built together were the zenith of the craft. They were not organic structures that grew over generations, like so many European castles. They were, for the most part, designed and built in a single massive push to a unified symmetrical plan. They were machines for control. Let us travel to North Wales and stand before one of them, Conwy. Built between 1283 and 1287, it rises from a narrow rock outcrop at the mouth of the Conwy estuary. It is a breathtaking sight. Its 8 massive round towers and high curtain walls seem to grow organically from the stone beneath. It is a linear castle, its shape dictated by the rock, with an outer and inner ward, each a fortress in its own right. But what was truly revolutionary was that the castle was part of a larger whole. Master James also built a complete set of town walls which connected directly to the castle. Inside these walls, Edward planted an English borough, a settlement of English merchants and colonists. The Welsh were not even allowed to live inside the walls of their own town. The castle and the town worked together as a single strategic unit. The castle protected the town, and the town with its port supplied the castle. It was a permanent English foothold, a garrison and an economic engine, planted deep in the heart of conquered territory. The sheer logistics are staggering. At its peak, nearly 1,000 men were working on Conwy. The final cost was around £15,000, an astronomical sum, more than 10 times the annual income of a great English baron. If Conwy was the perfect expression of strategic placement, then Caernarfon was the masterpiece of political symbolism. Situated on the Menai Strait, it was designed from the beginning to be the capital of the new English Principality of North Wales, and it had to look the part. Master James of St. George and King Edward did something extraordinary here. Instead of the usual round towers, they built massive polygonal towers, and the walls were not uniform grey stone. They were built with bands of different coloured masonry. Why? Because this was a deliberate echo of the greatest defensive walls in Christendom, the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, the capital of the old Roman Empire. Edward was not just building a fortress, he was making a statement. He was the new Constantine, bringing civilization and order to this wild land. The message was clear. English rule was not temporary. It was the heir to Rome itself, a force of history. In 1284, inside the half-finished walls of Caernarfon, Edward's wife, Eleanor of Castile, gave birth to a son, also named Edward. The king then presented his infant son to the Welsh people as their new prince, a prince born in Wales who spoke no English. It was a masterstroke of political theatre. Caernarfon was designed to be a royal palace, a seat of government, and an impregnable fortress all in one. It was power made manifest in stone, but for the purist, for the student of pure military architecture, the jewel in the iron ring is the last one, Beaumaris on the Isle of Anglesey. Construction began in 1295 after a final Welsh rebellion. Unlike Conwy or Caernarfon, which were built on dramatic rocky sites, Beaumaris was built on a flat, marshy plain. This gave Master James a blank canvas. He was not constrained by geography. Here he could build the most technically perfect, most symmetrical concentric castle ever conceived. It is a perfect walls-within-walls design. A low, octagonal outer wall with 12 towers and 2 gatehouses. A tidal moat connected to the sea that could accommodate a 40-ton ship right up to the castle's main gate. And inside that, a massive, towering inner wall, a quadrangle with 6 enormous towers and 2 huge gatehouses. The 2 gatehouses were not aligned, forcing any attacker who breached the outer gate to turn and expose themselves to fire from the inner battlements before they could even approach the second gate. Every single angle was covered by an arrow slit. There were over 300 of them. It was a flawlessly designed killing machine. From the air, it is the thing of breathtaking geometric beauty. For an attacker, it would have been a vision of hell. There is a final, poignant detail to Beaumaris. It was never finished. It was so ambitious, so perfect, and so colossally expensive that by the early 1300s, with his attention turning to a new war in Scotland, Edward's treasury simply ran dry. The towers of the inner ward never reached their full intended height. The royal accommodation was never built. Beaumaris stands today as the ultimate expression of the medieval castle builder's art, the absolute high watermark of its scientific development. It is the logical conclusion to a journey that began with simple wooden towers and ended with this sublime symmetrical fortress. It was, in its way, too perfect. So perfect, in fact, that it marked the end of an era. The age of the great castle was drawing to a close. A new sound was beginning to echo across the battlefields of Europe, a sound of thunder and smoke, a new science that would, in time, render even these magnificent walls of stone tragically beautifully obsolete. The stone keeps and curtain walls of England and France, for all their brutal familiarity, were but one dialect in the harsh language of medieval fortification. To truly understand the castle, we must let our minds drift across the water beyond the Channel, where the same fundamental need for security was shaped by profoundly different landscapes, different threats, and different ambitions. Let us travel east into the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, to the lands we now call Germany. Here, the castle was a creature of the heights. The German burg did not, as a rule, sit comfortably amidst fertile fields. It clawed its way to the summit. It clung to the crag. It was an eagle's nest of stone, a fortress defined by its relationship with the sheer, unforgiving vertical. Imagine the Rhine Valley, a vital artery of trade and a corridor of conflict. Along its dramatic gorge, castles sprouted from the hilltops like jagged teeth. These were not the sprawling concentric fortresses of Wales. Land was scarce on these peaks, the footing treacherous. German castle builders became masters of compression and height. Their keeps, known as the Burgfree, were often impossibly tall and slender, not intended as lordly residences, but as the ultimate watchtower and final refuge, a stone exclamation point of defiance. To attack a castle like Marksburg or the aptly named Katz, the Cat, was not simply to assault a wall. It was to fight gravity itself. Every step of the approach was uphill, exposed, exhausting. The defenders had the supreme advantage of elevation, raining down arrows and rocks upon soldiers who were already breathless from the climb. The castle was not merely a structure placed upon the landscape, it was an extension of the mountain itself, its walls often seeming to grow organically from the living rock. This verticality served another purpose too. From their lofty perches, the lord of the castle could see for miles. He could watch the river traffic, the slow-moving barges laden with wine and wool, and he could, if he was so inclined, demand a toll, a very firm, non-negotiable toll. The German Raubritter, the robber knight, is a figure born of this landscape, a predator whose stone lair gave him absolute command over the lifeblood of the valley below. His castle was less a centre of local governance and more a magnificently fortified customs house with exceptionally aggressive enforcement policies. Now, let us turn our gaze south and west to the sun-scorched plains of the Iberian Peninsula. Here, for centuries, a different kind of struggle unfolded. This was the world of the Reconquista, the long, slow, grinding reconquest of Spain and Portugal from the Moorish caliphates. Here, the frontier was not a static line, but a fluid, ever-shifting zone of raids and counter-raids. A castle was not just a home, it was a foothold, a stake driven into contested ground. The Spanish Castillo is a product of this relentless generations-long war. They are, as a result, overwhelmingly, brutally military. There is little softness here, little thought given to domestic comfort. The Castillo de Loare in Aragon, for instance, seems to be hewn from the same arid, stony ground on which it stands. Its lines are severe, its purpose unambiguous. It is a massive, self-contained instrument of war and occupation. Spanish castles often adopted a simple but effective plan. A large outer enclosure, the Albucara, to shelter villagers and livestock during a raid, and at its heart a towering, formidable keep, the Torre del Homenage. This was the heart of the castle, the last line of defence but also the symbolic core. It was here the Castellan swore his oath of fealty, pledging to hold the fortress for his king or die in the attempt. The very name, the Tower of Homage, speaks to its role as a vessel of loyalty in a treacherous landscape. And in the architecture itself, you can read the story of Spain's cultural collision. Christian builders retaking a town would often build upon or adapt the foundations of a Moorish alcazaba. In the centuries that followed, Moorish craftsmen, known as mudéjars, were employed by Christian lords, and they brought their own distinctive style to the work. You see it in the intricate brickwork, the horseshoe arches, the decorative tiles that soften the edges of these otherwise grim fortresses. The Alcazar of Segovia, which seems to sail like a stone ship above the plains, is a perfect fairy tale fusion of these sensibilities, a stern Castilian fortress dressed in the delicate geometric artistry of Islam. Each Castillo was a scar on the landscape, a memory of a battle won and a promise of the next one to come. And then there is Italy, a land of ancient cities, burgeoning trade, and viciously competitive families. Here, the classic rural castle governing a swathe of countryside certainly existed, but the true innovation was urban. In the bustling, crowded city-states of Florence, Siena, Bologna, and Genoa, the threat was not necessarily a foreign army at the gates. It was your neighbour. It was the family whose palace stood across the piazza, the rival faction who controlled the next street over. Power was a brutal, intimate game played out in a labyrinth of cobblestone and brick. And so the Italian nobility built upwards. The medieval Italian city skyline was not one of church spires alone, but a dense forest of private fortified towers. These case-torii, or tower houses, were the urban equivalent of the keep. The taller your tower, the more powerful your family. In cities like Bologna, hundreds of these slender, aggressive structures pierced the sky, a vertical expression of feudal anarchy. San Gimignano in Tuscany still preserves a haunting collection of these towers, allowing us to glimpse what this world looked like. A city of stone needles, where every great house was a self-contained fortress, ready to barricade its doors and wage war on its rivals block by block. The ruling families of these cities, the Visconti of Milan or the Scaligeri of Verona, took this a step further. Their castles were designed not just to defend the city from outside attack, but to dominate the city from within. The Castello Sforzesco in Milan is a colossal brick fortress, its massive walls and deep moats separating it from the very metropolis it was meant to protect. It was a clear and constant message to the citizens. We are your defenders, yes, but we are also your masters. If you should choose to rebel, these walls are not for keeping the French out, they are for keeping you in. The Italian castle in its urban form becomes a tool of internal suppression, a stone fist clenched in the very heart of the community it rules. From the wind-swept peaks of Germany to the arid plains of Spain and the crowded cities of Italy, the stone fortress adapted, mutated and evolved. It was a mirror, reflecting the unique fears and unique ambitions of the people who built them. But for all their regional variety, for all their unique architectural signatures born of landscape and conflict, these fortresses shared a common, deeper purpose. They were not merely shields of stone, they were the very engines of power. The castle was far more than a military installation. In the long stretches of peace, and even in a violent age, peace was the norm, war the exception, the fortress revealed its true nature. It was the administrative heart, the legal centre, and the economic hub of its domain. It was the machine that made the feudal world turn and step inside the gatehouse, past the watchful eyes of the guards, and cross the bustling bailey. The air is thick with the smells of wood-smoked livestock and baking bread. The sounds are of a blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of servants, the lowing of cattle. This is not just a garrison, it is a self-contained economic unit. But the true centre of this world is the Great Hall. Here, the non-military life of the castle unfolds in all its complexity. This cavernous space, with its high-timbered roof and smoke-blackened walls, was a room of 1,000 functions, and its primary one was administration. The lord of the manor, or more often his steward, would sit at a trestle table, presiding over the management of the entire estate. This was the central nervous system of the fief. Clerks with ink-stained fingers would scratch away on parchment, recording rents received, fines levied, and harvests tallied. Peasants from the surrounding villages would arrive to pay their dues, not always in coin but in kind. A procession of chickens, sacks of grain, barrels of ale, and rounds of cheese would be brought to the castle, recorded by the reeve, and stored in the castle's extensive cellars and granaries. The castle was, in effect, a giant fortified bank, warehouse and records office all in one. Its stone walls protected not just the lord's family, but the economic surplus of the entire region, the charters that guaranteed land ownership, The surveys that detailed every field and cottage, the ledgers that tracked every transaction, all were kept safe within the thickest walls, often in a dedicated treasury room or a heavy iron-bound chest in the Lord's own chamber. This was the source of power, not just the sword but the carefully kept record. The Great Hall would then transform, perhaps on a Tuesday morning, into a courthouse. The trestle tables would be rearranged, and the Lord would take his seat upon a raised chair ready to dispense justice. Feudal law was a complex tapestry of local custom, royal decree, and the Lord's own will. Here, disputes between tenants were settled, poachers were sentenced, and criminals were judged. The Lord's justice was swift, and rarely encumbered by an excess of evidence. In the earlier medieval period, guilt or innocence might be determined by ordeal, by carrying a hot iron or being submerged in water, a process left to the judgment of God. Later it became a matter of witnesses and testimony, but the outcome still rested entirely with the Lord. He held the power of high, middle, and low justice, which could mean anything from a small fine for a straying pig to the ultimate penalty of hanging for theft or murder. The gallows were often erected just outside the castle gates, a grim and constant reminder of where authority truly resided. The castle did not just protect the law, it was the law, made manifest in stone and iron. And of course the castle was a prison, the dungeon of popular imagination, that subterranean chamber of horrors filled with chains and skeletons, is largely a Gothic fantasy. While some castles did have purpose-built underground cells, the reality was often more mundane, and therefore perhaps even more chilling. Simple, cold, bored neglect. A prisoner, especially a high-status one, was more likely to be confined to a chamber in a remote tower, perhaps the gatehouse. A prison could be any secure room from which escape was difficult. Ransom was the goal for a captured knight, not punishment. He was a valuable asset, to be kept reasonably healthy until his family paid up. For a common criminal or a political inconvenience, however, the experience was far bleaker. They might be thrown into a cellar, an oubliette, from the French word oublier, to forget, where they were simply left, a problem to be solved by starvation and time. The castle's deepest, darkest spaces were reserved for those who were meant to disappear from the world, their existence erased by a stone lid and the passage of days. But above all, the castle was a stage. It was the theatre for the performance of lordship. Every aspect of its design, every daily ritual was calculated to project power and reinforce the social hierarchy. The very act of approaching a great castle was an exercise in intimidation. A visitor had to traverse the outer defences, pass under the menacing gaze of the gatehouse, cross the open space of the bailey under the eyes of the garrison, and finally be admitted to the great hall. Here the Lord would be seated at the high table, on a dais, physically elevated above everyone else. His guests and household would be arranged on long benches below, their proximity to him a precise measure of their status. The quality of the food they ate, the wine they drank, the very salt cellar they used, was all dictated by rank. A great feast was not just a meal, it was a political statement, a lavish display of wealth and generosity that bound his followers to him. The ceremony of a knight swearing fealty, kneeling before his master, placing his hands in his lord's, this sacred act of homage took place in the hall, witnessed by all. When the Lord rode out to hunt with his retinue of knights, falconers, and hounds, it was a pageant of aristocratic dominance. The castle was the backdrop for this continuous drama, its architecture amplifying the aura of the man who commanded it. Its height, its mass, its sheer unyielding permanence were all extensions of his own authority. It was a declaration in stone that his power was as solid and as enduring as the walls themselves. Yet even stone is not eternal. The world that had forged the castle, a world of localized violence and fragmented power, began to change. Slowly at first, then with gathering speed, the foundations of the feudal age started to shift, and the great stone fortresses began a long, graceful transformation. The forces that rendered the castle obsolete as a military machine were twofold. The first was political. Across Europe, from the late 14th century onwards, Powerful, centralizing monarchs began to consolidate their power. In France, England, and a unified Spain, the king was no longer just the most powerful of the feudal lords. He was becoming the sovereign ruler of a nation-state. These new monarchs had armies, they had bureaucracies, and most importantly, they had a growing monopoly on violence. A troublesome baron who might once have retreated to his castle to defy his king now faced the full might of a royal army, funded by national taxation. The private wars between nobles that had been the castle's raison d'etre were gradually suppressed. The king's peace and the king's justice began to extend across the entire realm. The second force was technological, and it arrived with a deafening roar: gunpowder. The earliest cannons were clumsy, unreliable, and often more dangerous to their own crews than to the enemy, but they improved relentlessly. By the mid-15th century, great siege bombards could be trundled into position, capable of hurling massive stone or iron balls with enough force to shatter even the strongest curtain wall. The Battle of Castillon in 1453, which effectively ended the 100 Years' War, was a decisive victory for French artillery over a traditional English army. The message was clear. A high stone wall was no longer an ultimate defence. It was a target. Castle builders tried to adapt. They built lower, thicker walls angled to deflect cannonballs. They constructed earthen ramparts in front of their stone walls to absorb the impact. They added circular gun platforms, or bastions, from which to mount their own artillery. But they were fighting a losing battle. A truly cannon-proof fortress, the star-shaped Pseudo Trace Italienne, that would dominate the next era of warfare, was ruinously expensive and required a level of engineering and geometric precision far beyond the means of a typical feudal lord. Only a king could afford to build one. The age of the private fortress was drawing to a close. As the military imperative waned, a new set of priorities emerged: comfort, status, and light. The castle began to let down its guard to open itself up to the world. It slowly shed its armour and transformed into something new: the palace fortress, the stately home, the country house. This evolution is written most clearly in the windows. The narrow arrow slit, designed for a defender to shoot through while remaining protected, gave way to the broad rectangular window, often divided by stone mullions and filled with precious, expensive glass. Lords and ladies wanted to see their estates. They wanted sunlight to flood the gloomy interiors of their halls and chambers. This single change speaks volumes. To install a large glass window in a ground floor wall was a profound statement of confidence. It was an announcement that you no longer lived in daily fear of a surprise attack. Inside, the chilly, cavernous spaces of the old keep were subdivided. The desire for privacy, a concept almost alien to the communal life of the early medieval castle, began to take hold. Lords and their families retreated from the great hall into their own private apartments. The solar, the withdrawing room, the ladies' bower. These rooms were designed for comfort. Grand fireplaces with intricately carved mantelpieces replaced the inefficient central hearth. Walls were no longer left as bare, cold stone. They were plastered, painted with colourful frescoes, or, for the truly wealthy, hung with thick woolen tapestries that provided both the insulation and a vibrant narrative spectacle. Corridors were introduced, meaning one no longer had to walk through a series of other people's chambers to get to one's own. Even sanitation saw a modest improvement, with guardrobes built to be less drafty and their chutes more discreetly managed. The castle was becoming a home. The military features that remained became increasingly ornamental. The fierce battlements, the crenellations that had once sheltered crossbowmen, were now carved into delicate, decorative patterns. The intimidating gatehouse, once a sequence of death traps, was transformed into a grand, symmetrical and welcoming entrance, adorned with coats of arms instead of murder holes. Moats, no longer needed to frustrate siege towers and miners, were widened and landscaped into serene, reflective lakes. Towers became elegant turrets, their purpose more aesthetic than defensive, designed to create a romantic, historicising skyline. Nowhere is this transformation more beautiful than in the Loire Valley of France. As the 15th century turned to the 16th, the French nobility, flush with new wealth and enchanted by the ideals of the Italian Renaissance, began to build a series of magnificent chateaux. A building like the Château de Chenonceau, which gracefully arches across the River Cher, has the silhouette of a castle, with its turrets and steep roofs, but it is a palace of pleasure. Its wide windows, its elegant galleries, and its lavishly decorated interiors are all dedicated to courtly life, not to war. The Château de Chambord, built by King Francis I, is perhaps the ultimate expression of this shift. It is a gargantuan structure, bristling with a forest of towers, turrets, and chimneys, a deliberate and fantastical echo of the medieval fortress. Yet it is entirely unfortified. Its walls are thin, its windows enormous. It was never intended to withstand a siege. It was designed to host a hunting party. It is a castle of pure pageantry, a monument whose military architecture has become a form of symbolic language, speaking of ancient power and noble lineage, while its true purpose is luxury and the magnificent display of royal status. The castle, born in the harsh necessity of a violent age, had finally completed its journey. The warrior had laid down his sword, taken off his helmet, and basked at last in the warmth of the sun streaming through a clear glass window. For centuries the great stone castle had been the answer to a violent and uncertain world. It was a declaration of power, a fulcrum of control, a stony anchor in the shifting tides of feudal politics. Its high walls, its cunning gatehouses, its grim towers, oars, all were designed to exhaust, to intimidate, to outlast. The siege was a contest of patience, of engineering, of attrition. The trebuchet could hurl massive stones, the battering ram could splinter the thickest oak doors, and the sapper could undermine the strongest foundations. But a well-built, well-provisioned castle could endure for months, even years. It was the ultimate defensive technology. And then a new sound began to echo across the battlefields of Europe. It was not the familiar creak of winding gear or the thud of stone on stone. It was a deep, guttural roar, a violent, instantaneous explosion that smelled of sulphur and brimstone. It was the sound of the future arriving, and it was a death knell for the age of the castle. Gunpowder, that strange and volatile black dust from the east, had been known in Europe for some time, used in primitive rockets and firecrackers, a curious novelty. But in the 14th century, military engineers began to grasp its true potential, the power of contained explosive force. The first cannons were crude, almost comically so. They were little more than cast iron or bronze pots, sometimes called a pot de fer or iron pot, which lobbed heavy arrow-like bolts with a deafening bang and a cloud of acrid smoke. They were inaccurate, terrifyingly slow to load, and just as likely to explode and kill their own crew as they were to harm the enemy. For a long time the defenders on the castle walls could look down on these new contraptions with a degree of contempt. They were noisy, certainly, but hardly more effective than the old reliable trebuchet. But the technology evolved with terrifying speed. The pots grew into barrels, the barrels grew into monsters. These were the bombards of the late 14th and early 15th centuries, colossal, immobile pieces of artillery, sometimes forged from hoops of iron bound together like a barrel. They had to be assembled on site, dragged into position by immense teams of oxen, and aimed not with precision, but by painstakingly building a wooden cradle and piling up earth behind them. Each shot was a major logistical undertaking. It could take hours to load one of these behemoths, ramming down the coarse black powder, the wadding, and finally the massive stone ball, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds. The gun crew would light the fuse and run for cover. The resulting explosion would shake the very ground, sending a stone cannonball on a low, flat trajectory not over the wall, as a trebuchet would, but at it. And this made all the difference. A trebuchet's projectile struck the wall with the force of gravity, a powerful but diffuse impact that might weaken the mortar or dislodge a few stones over time. A cannonball, however, arrived with the focused kinetic energy of a directed explosion. The first shot might do little more than chip the surface. The second, aimed at the same spot, would dig a little deeper. The third, the fourth, the 10th, the 50th, each one striking the same point with brutal, concussive force, did not just batter the wall, it pulverised it. The stone, once a symbol of permanence, shattered. The shockwaves travelled deep into the core of the wall, cracking the structure from within. Eventually a small hole would appear, then a larger one, until, with a great groan and a cascade of rubble, a section of the curtain wall would simply collapse, creating a breach wide enough for an army to pour through. The high vertical walls that had been the castle's greatest strength had suddenly become its most profound vulnerability. They were now just a target. Nowhere was this new reality demonstrated more starkly than in 1453, outside the legendary walls of Constantinople. The Theodosian walls were perhaps the most formidable defensive system ever conceived in the pre-gunpowder age, a triple line of fortifications that had repelled every attacker for 1,000 years. But the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, did not come with trebuchets alone. He brought with him an artillery train of unprecedented scale, including a monstrous bombard known as the Basilic, cast for him by a Hungarian engineer named Orban. This cannon was over 27 feet long and could fire a stone ball weighing more than half a ton. It took 60 oxen to drag it into position. Its roar, they said, could be heard for miles, and its impact shook the ancient city to its foundations. Day after day the great cannons, alongside dozens of smaller pieces, relentlessly hammered the same sections of the ancient walls. The Byzantine defenders worked heroically, trying to repair the damage each night with barrels of earth and rubble, but it was a hopeless task. They were patching a crumbling dam. On May 29th, the cannons blasted a final irreparable breach, and the city that had stood for a millennium finally fell. The world had changed. What happened in Constantinople was a dramatic spectacle, but the true end of the Castle Age was a quieter, more systematic affair that played out across the fields of France. During the final phase of the 100 Years' War, the French king, Charles VII, invested heavily in a professional mobile artillery train, expertly managed by the brothers Jean and Gaspard Bureau. They abandoned the unwieldy, immobile bombards for more manageable bronze-cast cannons that could be moved by horse teams and aimed with greater accuracy. From 1449 to 1450, this Royal Artillery Corps moved systematically through Normandy, reducing the English-held castles one by one. Harfleur, a major stronghold, fell in a single day. The fortress of Caen held out for a mere 3 weeks. Castles that had once been capable of withstanding year-long sieges were now surrendering in a matter of days. The Bureau brothers' campaign was a masterpiece of logistics and engineering, a relentless, efficient demolition of the old feudal order. The English garrisons, secure behind walls their ancestors had held for generations, could do nothing but watch as their stone shields were methodically dismantled from a safe distance. Military engineers scrambled to adapt. If high walls were a liability, the answer must be low walls. Walls were thickened, and their profiles lowered, sometimes behind massive earthen banks called ramparts, designed to absorb the shock of a cannonball rather than shatter. Tall, square towers, which presented a perfect flat target and had vulnerable corners, were replaced with low, rounded bastions from which defenders could mount their own cannons to fire back. The entire geometry of fortification began to change. The castle began to sink into the earth, its elegant vertical lines giving way to a squat, angular footprint designed to deflect cannon fire and create interlocking fields of defensive fire. This new style, the Tres Italienne or Star Fort, was a brilliant and effective response to gunpowder. But it was no longer a castle. It was not a home for a lord, a centre of administration, or a symbol of noble prestige. It was a pure military machine, a gun platform. The age of the high stone fortress, the iconic medieval castle, was over. The cannon's roar had silenced it for good. The thunder of the cannons faded, replaced by a much quieter, more patient force of destruction. Time. For the next 300 years, the great castles of Europe, now militarily useless and economically burdensome, entered a long, slow twilight. Their lords and ladies had already begun to move out, abandoning the cold, draughty, and poorly lit stone keeps for elegant, unfortified manor houses and sprawling country palaces built for comfort, not for war. The castle became a relic, a grandparents' home that was too expensive to heat and too far from the city, and so they began to crumble. Some were deliberately dismantled, a process known as slighting. After the English Civil War in the mid-17th century, Oliver Cromwell's parliamentarian forces, wary of these royalist strongholds ever being used again, systematically slighted hundreds of castles. At Corfe Castle in Dorset, engineers tunnelled under the keep and the gatehouse, packed the tunnels with gunpowder and blew them apart. Great sections of tower and wall were lifted into the air, only to fall back to earth at strange drunken angles, where they still lie today, a permanent jarring monument to political expediency. More common than this deliberate violence was a slow, quiet cannibalism. A castle, after all, was a mountain of pre-cut high-quality stone sitting conveniently in the landscape. For local villagers and farmers, the abandoned fortress on the hill was not a historical monument. It was a free quarry. For generations, they came with carts and levers, prying away the perfectly squared ashlar blocks to build new farmhouses, to repair the village church, to line their fields with stone walls. The lead from the roofs was stripped and melted down. The great oak beams were repurposed. The castle was slowly, piece by piece, reabsorbed back into the community it once dominated, its very substance scattered across the landscape. Weeds grew in the courtyards. Ivy, the patient green conqueror, crept over the walls, its tendrils probing into the mortar, slowly and inexorably pushing the stones apart. Roofs collapsed, letting in the rain, which washed out the mortar and rotted the remaining wood. Towers that had stood for 500 years finally gave way, collapsing in a silent cloud of dust. The castle became a picturesque ruin, a skeleton picked clean by pragmatism and neglect. And then, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, people began to look at these skeletons in a new way. The intellectual climate of Europe was shifting. The cool, rational logic of the Enlightenment was giving way to the passion, emotion, and imagination of the Romantic movement. The Romantics were captivated by the past, not as a series of neat historical facts, but as a source of sublime and powerful feelings. And nothing was more sublime than a ruined castle. Artists like J.M.W. Turner and John Constable travelled the countryside painting these ivy-clad ruins. They depicted them silhouetted against dramatic stormy skies or bathed in the soft melancholic light of a setting sun. The broken towers and crumbling walls were no longer signs of failure and decay. They were beautiful, poignant symbols of the passage of time, of the transience of human power in the face of nature's patient reclamation. The ruin became an object of aesthetic contemplation. Writers, too, fell under the spell. The Gothic novel was born, and the ruined castle was its perfect setting. In Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, the fortress is a place of supernatural terror, rattling chains, secret passages, and ancestral curses. Sir Walter Scott, in novels like Ivanhoe, reimagined the medieval world as a place of high adventure, noble knights, and chivalric romance, with the castle as its grand stage. This was a complete reinvention. The historical reality of the castle, a cold, damp, often brutal instrument of military and political control, was papered over with a rich tapestry of myth. The castle was no longer a fortress. It was a backdrop for heroism, a vessel for nostalgia, a place where the modern world, with its factories and its rationalism, could be forgotten. This romantic fever led to a new kind of construction and a new kind of destruction. The newly wealthy industrialists of the 19th century, eager to buy themselves a piece of aristocratic heritage, began purchasing old castles and restoring them. This restoration was often driven more by romantic fantasy than by historical accuracy. In France, the architect Eugène Viollet-le-Duc was put in charge of national monuments, and he undertook massive, controversial restorations of places like the great walled city of Carcassonne. He didn't just preserve what was there, he rebuilt it according to his idealized scholarly vision of what a medieval fortress should have looked like, adding pointed, conical witch hat roofs to the towers that were more typical of northern France than the south. In Wales, the architect William Burgess, funded by the fabulously wealthy Marquess of Bute, transformed Cardiff Castle and Castell Coch into neo-Gothic fantasies with lavishly painted interiors, fantastical carvings, and opulent furnishings that would have been utterly alien to any actual medieval lord. The ultimate expression of this romantic obsession was not a restoration at all, but a creation. In the Bavarian Alps, King Ludwig II, a man lost in his own Wagnerian dreams, built Neuschwanstein. It is the castle that everyone knows, the one that floats in the popular imagination. But it is not a medieval castle. It is a 9th century palace designed to look like one. It has all the towers, turrets, and battlements, but it was built long after the age of sieges had passed. It was equipped with central heating, flushing toilets, and even a telephone. Neuschwanstein was never meant to withstand a cannon. It was built to withstand reality. It was a theatrical set piece, a monument to a fantasy of the Middle Ages. The physical castle had first been defeated by gunpowder, then consumed by time, and was now resurrected, not as a fortress, but as a dream. And it was this dream, more than the stony reality, that would conquer the imagination of the modern world. This resurrected dream of the castle, polished by poets and rebuilt by romantics, proved to be far more durable than stone and mortar. While the physical ruins settled into a quiet, dignified role as protected national heritage sites, their imaginary counterparts began to multiply, colonising the vast new territories of popular culture. The castle became one of the most powerful and enduring symbols in our collective vocabulary, a piece of visual shorthand for an entire world of fantasy, history, and adventure. Its most fertile new ground was in the pages of fantasy literature, a genre that took the romanticised vision of the Middle Ages and codified it into a universe of its own. No one understood the symbolic power of the castle better than J.R.R. Tolkien. For him, castles were not mere settings. They were characters, imbued with the history and spirit of the peoples who built them. Think of the Hornburg at Helm's Deep, a fortress nestled into the mountainside, a bastion of the world of men, its deepening wall representing a last, desperate stand against a tide of monstrous chaos. Or consider Minas Tirith, the seven-tiered white city, a breathtaking vision of order and ancient resilience, its prow of stone jutting out in defiance of the darkness gathering in Mordor. These were not just places to be defended, they were the very embodiment of what was being fought for: history, culture, and civilization itself. From Tolkien onwards, the castle became a foundational trope of the fantasy genre. In C.S. Lewis's Narnia, the four Pevensey children rule from the seaside castle of Caer Paravel, a symbol of the land's restored golden age. In virtually every fantasy epic that followed, the castle is the locus of power, the safe haven, the king's court, the centre of light in a dark and dangerous world. It is the place the heroes must defend, or the dark fortress the heroes must assault. It represents order against the encroaching wilderness, a pocket of human or elven or dwarven logic in a world governed by magic and monsters. This literary image flowed seamlessly onto the screen, where the castle's visual power could be fully unleashed. From the swashbuckling adventures of Errol Flynn to the sprawling epics of today, a single shot of a castle on a hill instantly establishes a setting. It tells the audience that we are in a pre-industrial world, a world of swords and monarchs, a world where the rules are different. In the world of Game of Thrones, the castles are as varied and memorable as the families who inhabit them. The grim, hardy strength of Winterfell, the sun-drenched, treacherous beauty of the Red Keep in King's Landing, the impossibly high and isolated Eyrie. Each is a reflection of the power and psychology of its owners. And then there is the most influential castle of all, one seen by more people than any historical fortress. the one at the beginning of every Walt Disney movie. The Disney castle, modelled directly on Ludwig's fantastical Neuschwanstein, cemented the castle in the minds of generations of children as the ultimate symbol of fairy tale magic. It is the home of the princess, the destination at the end of the quest, the place where happily ever after begins. This sanitised romantic vision, stripped of all its historical grit, of the latrines, the cold, the smoke, the political brutality, has become the dominant popular image. It is the castle as pure aspiration, a shimmering emblem of royalty and romance. It is this version that is replicated in theme parks around the globe, a physical manifestation of a cultural fantasy. Even the magical school of Hogwarts in the Harry Potter series is, in essence, a castle, a sprawling, ancient, mysterious fortress, full of secret passages and hidden chambers, a bastion of good in the fight against a dark lord.